I spent 11 years with the US Forest Service, most of them in the Monongahela and the stretches of national forest that spill down into the folds of southern West Virginia. And I want to tell you that I loved that job the way you love a difficult marriage. It asked everything of me and gave back a kind of quiet I have never found anywhere since. I am 58 now. I live in a subdivision outside Roanoke where every house looks like the one beside it, and I mow my little square of grass on Saturdays, and I go to a Presbyterian church I do not believe in because my wife likes the music. I tell you this so you understand that I am not a man who is looking for attention, and I am not a man who has anything left to gain from lying. I have a pension. I have grandchildren. I have a name in this valley that people still respect. I am putting all of that at risk by writing this down, and I have decided I no longer care, because I am running out of years, and I do not want to carry it alone into whatever comes next. What I am going to describe happened in the autumn of 1994, in a section of ridge country in the Appalachians that I am not going to name precisely, and you will understand why by the end. I have changed a few things. I have changed some names, and I have blurred some locations, and I have moved one or two small details around to protect people who do not deserve to be dragged into this. I have not changed the important thing. The important thing is true, and I will swear to it before God and before whatever else is up on that mountain, which I have come to believe is a good deal older than God and considerably less interested in mercy. Let me start with the ordinary parts, because the ordinary parts are what made the rest impossible to dismiss. In those years, my main responsibility was boundary and access work. That meant I spent my days confirming that the maps we relied on matched the ground under my boots. It is not glamorous work. People imagine a forest ranger as a man who rescues lost hikers and gives talks to school children about black bears, and I did some of that. But the bones of the job were surveying, timber sale boundary marking, checking old logging roads for washouts, walking property lines between federal land and the private inholdings that were scattered through the forest, like raisins in a loaf of bread. Appalachia is not clean, cartographically speaking. It was settled in a piecemeal, feuding, stubborn way, and the land records reflect that. There are family plots and church parcels and mineral rights and grazing easements laid over one another, going back to the 1790s, and a good part of my job was untangling that mess with a compass, a measuring wheel, a stack of plats, and a great deal of patience. I mention all of this because I want you to know that I was, at that time, probably one of 2 or 3 people alive who genuinely knew that country. Not knew it the way a hunter knows his favorite hollow, but knew it the way a mapmaker knows it, comprehensively, from the survey markers up. When I tell you that something was not on any map, I am not a tourist saying that. I am the man whose literal job was the maps. I was good at it too. I don't say that to boast. I say it because it matters to the story, that I was not a careless man, not a man who got lost, not a man who mistook one drainage for another, or misread a compass, or invented survey pins where there were none. I had a reputation in the district for accuracy. When 2 old plats disagreed with each other, they sent me to walk the ground and settle it, and I settled it, and I was right, and everyone knew I was right. There was a running joke in the office that if I said a pin was there, you could go dig it up blindfolded. I bring this up because in what follows I need you to trust my competence in exactly the same way my supervisors trusted it, because my competence is the whole reason the thing that happened cannot be explained away. I was married by then, to my first wife, and we did not have children yet, and the marriage was already going bad in the slow, quiet way that marriages go bad when one person needs the woods and the other person needs a husband who comes home. I spent a great deal of time alone in the field, and I preferred it, and she knew I preferred it, and that knowledge sat between us at the dinner table, like a third person nobody wanted to introduce. I tell you this because I want you to understand that when I went up on that mountain in October of 1994, I went gladly. I went the way a man goes to the one place where he feels like himself. If I had been happier at home, maybe I would not have followed that road, but I was not happier at home, and I did follow it, and there is no undoing that now. That fall I was working a resurvey along a section of the forest that had come up because of a land dispute. A timber company wanted to run a road through to a stand they had bought the cutting rights to, and a family named Coulter, who had held an inn holding up there since before the forest was federalized, claimed the proposed road crossed their parcel. The Forest Service needed the old boundaries confirmed, and I drew the assignment because I had done work in that district before, and because, frankly, the younger guys did not want it. It was remote, it was steep. The nearest paved road was 40 minutes of white-knuckle gravel from the trailhead, and the trailhead itself was another 2 hours of hard hiking from where I actually needed to be. Before I went in, I did what I always did, which was my homework. I drove out to talk to the Coulters, because when a family has held ground for 200 years, the family knows things the maps don't. The Coulter place was a cluster of houses and trailers up a hollow, dogs everywhere, an old man on a porch who turned out to be the patriarch, a fellow named Emmett Coulter, who must have been near 90 and who had a mind like a bear trap. I explained what I was doing and where I'd be, and I asked him about the old boundaries, and he was helpful, mostly. He drew me a rough map on the back of a feed store receipt of where the old lines ran, and it matched my plats close enough that I trusted him. But when I mentioned that I'd be working down toward the Sable Run drainage, following the eastern boundary line, the old man got quiet. He had been talkative up to that point, glad of the company the way old men in hollows are glad of company. And then I said Sable Run, and he stopped talking, and he looked at me for a while, and then he said something I did not understand at the time, and understood too well later. He said, "Don't you go down in that bottom." He said the family had always kept clear of that bottom. I asked him why, expecting some story about a rock slide or bad water, or a boundary feud, the ordinary reasons mountain families keep clear of a piece of ground. And he said, "That's the church's ground down there, and we don't have no truck with the church, and neither should you." I asked him what church. There was no church on any map. And Emmett Coulter looked at me like I was simple, and he said, "The church that sings." And then his daughter came out on the porch and said something sharp to him about tiring himself out, and she looked at me in a way that ended the conversation, and I thanked them and I left, and I wrote in my notebook, in the truck, before I forgot it. Coulter says, "Avoid Sable Run bottom, church's ground, the church that sings." Superstition, old feud, check county records. I have that notebook. That entry is dated the 9th of October 1994, 4 days before I walked down into that bottom. It is not a thing I invented afterward. I wrote it down before, when it was just an old man's strange words, when I thought I was collecting local color, when the worst thing I imagined the phrase might mean was some family scandal 100 years buried. I want that on the record. I was warned. It is in my own hand, in ink, before any of it happened. I went in on a Monday, the second week of October. The leaves were at their peak, which anybody who has been in those mountains in October will tell you is one of the most beautiful things a human being can witness. The whole world gone red and gold and burning, and the air so clean it hurts your teeth. I had provisions for 6 days, a radio, my survey gear, and the plats. I had told dispatch my route and my check-in schedule. I was experienced, I was equipped, and I was completely alone, which is exactly how I liked it. The first 2 days were unremarkable in the best way. I found the old iron survey pins from the 1930s CCC era work, almost exactly where the plats said they would be, which is rare and satisfying, like finding a word you forgot you knew. I walked the ridgeline. I ate my dinners cold to avoid the fuss of a fire. I slept well. I remember the first 2 nights as good nights, the kind of nights that are the reason a man takes a job like mine, lying in a small tent on a high ridge, with the whole burning forest below me, and the stars overhead so thick they looked spilled. I remember thinking, on the second night, that I was a lucky man, whatever was going wrong at home, that I got paid to be in a place this beautiful and this quiet. On the third day I was working my way down the eastern slope of the ridge, toward the drainage the old maps called Sable Run, following a boundary line that should have brought me to a corner marker near the confluence of 2 streams. I will admit that Emmett Coulter's words were in my mind. I am not going to pretend I had forgotten them, but I was a professional man doing a professional job, and the boundary line ran where the boundary line ran, and I was not going to skip a section of my survey, because a 90-year-old man had spooked himself with an old family story. I told myself I would walk the line, confirm the corner marker, and be back up on the ridge by dark, and that would be that. The line brought me instead to a road. Now, an old road in that country is not itself remarkable. The whole forest is threaded with abandoned logging grades and wagon roads and skid trails, most of them decades or a century out of use, grown over but still readable to a trained eye by the cut of the bank and the flatness of the bed. I had walked hundreds of them. What stopped me was that this road was on none of my maps, not the current topo, not the historical plats going back to the 1890s, not the CCC-era survey, not the timber company's own reconnaissance overlays, which were meticulous because they wanted every inch of merchantable timber accounted for. I had, spread in my pack, essentially the complete cartographic memory of that mountain across 100 years of American record-keeping, and not one document showed a road where I was standing. And it was a real road. That was the thing. It was not a game trail or a wishful line of slightly flatter ground. It had been graded. It had culverts, stone-lined, the kind of dry-laid masonry that takes a skilled hand and a great deal of labor. It had a crown to shed water. It ran along the contour with the kind of intelligent engineering that told me it had been surveyed by someone who knew what they were doing. And it ran in a direction that made no sense, which is to say it ran deeper into the drainage, away from any settlement or landing or mill site that appeared in any record. I stood there for a while. I want to be honest about my emotional state, because it matters. I was not afraid. I was delighted, and underneath the delight, there was a small cold thread of the thing Emmett Coulter had put in me, but the delight was stronger. A discovery like that is a small professional thrill. My first thought was that I had stumbled onto an unrecorded piece of history, maybe a private road built by the Coulter family generations ago, maybe some old mining access that had escaped the record. My second thought, which I did not much like, was that this was the church's ground, and that the old man had known this road was here, and that his family had kept clear of it for 2 centuries. I got out my notebook. I noted the coordinates as best I could establish them. I photographed the culverts and the roadbed with the little 35mm camera I carried for documentation. And then, because I am the kind of person I am, I decided to follow it. That decision has cost me 30 years of sleep. I want to try to describe the walk down that road, because in the retelling it always sounds like nothing. A man walking downhill on an old road, and it was not nothing. The road descended for perhaps 1.5 miles. It was easy walking, easier than anything I had done in 3 days, and the ease of it was itself a little unnerving after so much steep ground. There is a wrongness to easy ground in the mountains. The mountains do not give you anything for free, and when they seem to, you should be suspicious. The road did not switch back the way a road should on that grade. It descended smoothly, almost gently, as though the mountain had softened itself to let it through. The leaves overhead thinned as the road dropped into the drainage, and there was a heaviness to the air down there, a stillness. It got colder, which is normal. Cold air pools in the low places, but this was more than that. It was a stillness in the sound of the world. Up on the ridge there had been the constant small noise of the forest, wind in the canopy, the tick and rustle of falling leaves, the calls of jays and the scold of squirrels, the whole busy machinery of an October woods. As I descended, that machinery shut down, section by section, the way lights go out in a building at the end of a workday. First the birds, then the small movements in the leaf litter, then even the wind, which simply stopped, so that the last 1/4 mile of that road I walked through, air that did not move at all, in a silence so total that I could hear the blood in my own ears. I told myself I was imagining it, or that I had simply walked out of the range of the ridge songbirds and into a colder, deeper pocket of forest where things kept to themselves. I am telling you now that I was not imagining it. I have been in quiet woods 1,000 times. This was not quiet. This was a place where sound had been asked to leave and had left. The road ended at a clearing, and in the clearing there was a church. I need to describe it carefully, because everything depends on the church being exactly what it was, and not what your imagination wants to make it. It was a white frame church in the plain Appalachian style, the kind you can still find at every third crossroads in that country. A single gabled room, with a steeple over the entrance, and tall, narrow windows down each side. It was small, maybe 40 feet by 25. It sat on a foundation of dry-laid stone. It had a double front door of vertical planks with iron strap hinges. There was a modest steeple with a louvered belfry, and I could see, when I looked, that there was a bell in it, and it was in good repair. That is what I could not reconcile. An abandoned church in that country, after even 20 years, would be a ruin. The roof would be gone. The windows would be broken by weather and vandals and time. The paint would be grey and peeling, and the frame would be sagging toward the ground, because those mountains take everything back, and they take it fast. I have walked into homesteads that were lived in within living memory, and found nothing but a chimney and a lilac bush. But this church, in the bottom of a drainage that did not exist on any map, at the end of a road that did not exist on any map, was painted white, not fresh, but white. The windows were intact. The roof was sound. The grass in the clearing was not tall and gone to seed, the way in abandoned churchyards would be, but was low and even, the way grass looks when something keeps it down, though I saw no livestock and no evidence of mowing. More than that, and this is the detail I have never been able to put down, the church was clean, not just intact, clean. There was no leaf litter on the steps, though the clearing was surrounded by trees dropping their leaves by the thousand. There was no moss on the north side of the roof, though everything in those woods that has stood still for a season wears moss on its north side. The windows had the faint, uneven shine of old glass that has been recently wiped. Somebody cared for this building. Somebody cared for it constantly, tenderly, the way you care for a thing you cannot let go of, and yet the place was silent and empty, and there was not a footprint or a tire track or a woodpile or a single sign of a living human being anywhere in that clearing, except the impossible cleanliness itself. There was a cemetery beside it, perhaps 40 stones, in the old style, some of them just field stones with no inscription, some of them proper carved markers. There was a low stone wall around the whole property, the same dry-laid masonry as the culverts. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. I called out. My voice sounded strange in that stillness, thin, like it did not travel the way it should have. It went out from me, and it just stopped, a few feet away, as though the air itself had absorbed it. I have heard people describe a sound being swallowed, and I always thought it was a figure of speech, until I stood in that clearing and heard my own voice get swallowed. Nobody answered. I told myself the obvious explanation, which was that this was the private church of some backwoods family, maybe the Coulters, despite what Emmett had said, maybe some congregation that had held on here in isolation the way people did, and that it was maintained by descendants who came up on Decoration Day to tend the graves and keep the paint fresh. That is a real thing in Appalachia. There are family cemeteries and one-room churches deep in the forest that families have tended for a century and a half, driving in on roads that only they know. It is exactly the kind of thing that would not show up on a federal topo map if the access was private and the parcel was an old in-holding. That explanation held together. It held together well enough that I walked into the clearing. The cemetery drew me first. I have always read cemeteries the way other people read newspapers, and a family plot tells you the whole story of a place, if you know how to look. I went to the stones, and here is where the ordinary explanation began, very quietly, to come apart. The stones were old. The carved ones bore dates ranging from the 1850s through, as best I could make out, the early part of this century. Common enough. But there were names on those stones I recognized, and not from that county. I want to be careful here. I read a lot of local history in my work, and there were surnames on those markers that belonged to families the record said had died out or moved away generations ago. Families I knew only from land deeds and old census abstracts. Families from 3 or 4 different counties, from hollows 15 and 20 miles apart, that had no reason to bury their dead together. It was as though someone had gathered the dead from a dozen scattered communities and brought them all to this one place, and the death dates clustered strangely. There was a run of them, a dozen or more, all within the same 2 years, 1889 and 1890, the way a graveyard looks after an epidemic or a disaster. I stood there doing the arithmetic that a man does in a graveyard without meaning to, reading the little spans. This one lived 60 years. This one lived 4. This one was a woman who died the same year as 3 of her children. and the pattern of it, all that death crowded into 2 winters, told the story of a catastrophe before I knew there had been one. But it was the freshness that stopped me, not of the stones, of the graves, because among the old markers there were newer mounds, not old sunken graves that had settled over decades into shallow depressions, which is what old graves become, fresh mounds, rounded, dark, the soil not yet compacted, the grass not yet grown back over the bare dirt. Someone had been buried here recently, several someones, and there were no markers on the fresh graves at all, just the bare mounded earth, dark against the even grass, 5 of them, or 6, in a row along the far wall, the newest, so recent that the soil was still damp and crumbed, the way turned earth looks, within a day or 2 of the shovel. I stood over those fresh mounds in the failing afternoon light, and for the first time that day, I felt something that was not delight. I did not name it fear yet, I named it caution. There were people connected to this place, clearly, living people, people who had dug graves here within days, and I was a federal officer standing uninvited in their private cemetery, and the smart thing to do, the professional thing, was to note it all, photograph what I could, and get back up the ridge to a place where I could think, and, when I next raised dispatch, report an unrecorded inholding with occupancy. I remember making that decision consciously and feeling relieved by it, the relief of a man who has decided to leave a place he should not be. I took my photographs. I have them still. I want to describe one in particular because it becomes important. I photographed the front of the church straight on, from perhaps 60 feet away, to document its condition. In the viewfinder, the church was empty and the doors were closed, and I remember that specifically because I framed the shot on the closed doors and the dark of the belfry above them, and I remember thinking, framing it, that it was a lonesome-looking building, that there was something in the shut-up look of it that made me want to be done and gone. I pressed the shutter. I advanced the film. That is a motion I have done 10,000 times, automatic as breathing. I lowered the camera. Then I heard the singing. It came from inside the church. It was not loud. It was the sound of a small number of voices, maybe 6 or 8, singing a hymn in the old shape note style, the unaccompanied, austere, minor key harmony that you can still hear in the oldest congregations in those mountains, a sound that is beautiful and terrible in about equal measure, and that predates the sentimental Sunday school hymns most Americans think of when they think of church music. I knew the style. I did not know the hymn. There was no organ, no piano, nothing but the voices, and the voices moved together in that stark old harmony that seems to come from underneath the earth rather than from human chests, and the hair on my arms and on the back of my neck stood straight up, all at once, before my mind had even caught up to what was wrong. What was wrong was this: the church, which I had called into not 20 minutes before and received no answer from, which I had watched with its doors shut and its windows empty, which I had just that moment photographed as an empty and closed-up building, was full of people singing. I will tell you exactly what I did, because I have gone over it 10,000 times, and I still do not know if it was brave or foolish. I did not run. My professional self took over, the same self that had walked me calmly off collapsing slopes and away from bears, the self that treats fear as information to be managed rather than obeyed. I told myself that a congregation had arrived while I was reading the stones, that I had been absorbed and had not heard them come, that they had entered through the back, or that they had been there all along and had simply not answered a stranger's call, which would not be unusual for isolated mountain people wary of outsiders. I told myself all of that, and none of it was true, and part of me knew none of it was true even as I told it, because I had been watching that clearing, and I would have seen 6 or 8 people walk into a building 60 feet in front of me, and there had been no one, and now there were voices. I walked to the front doors of the church, and I knocked, and I called out that I was with the Forest Service, and I meant no harm, and I only wanted to speak with whoever was in charge. The singing stopped, not gradually, the way singing stops when people notice a visitor and trail off. It stopped all at once, on a note, mid-word, as though a single switch had been thrown, and the silence that followed was the most complete silence I have ever stood inside. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the fabric of my jacket move when I breathed. I could hear, I swear to you, the small sound of my own eyelids when I blinked. The silence had weight. It pressed on my eardrums the way deep water presses. I have never before or since experienced a silence that I could feel as a physical pressure, and I stood in it, in front of those plank doors, with my hand still half raised from knocking, and I understood, in my body before my mind would allow it, that I had done something I should not have done. And then the doors opened, from the inside, and there was a man standing in the doorway. He was old, not frail, but old, the way a fence post is old, weathered down to something hard and essential. He wore a dark suit of a cut I could not place, plain, collarless, the kind of clothing you see in photographs from before the First World War. His face was clean-shaven and deeply lined, and his eyes were a pale grey that seemed almost without colour in the dimness of the doorway. Behind him the church was dark. I could not see the congregation. I could only feel them, that particular pressure of being looked at by many people you cannot see, the pressure you feel on the back of your neck in a crowd, except that it came from the darkness in front of me, where there was, as far as my eyes could tell, no one at all. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, in an accent so thick and so archaic that I had to work to understand it, that I was not expected. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way you would tell a man he had come on the wrong day, with a kind of weary patience, almost with sympathy. He said I was not expected, and that it was not the time, and that I should not have found the road. And then he said, half to himself, that the road did not open for everyone, and he looked at me differently when he said it, with a sharpening attention, as though the fact of my having found the road told him something about me that he was still deciding how to feel about. I told him who I was, and what I was doing there. I told him about the survey, the boundary, the timber company's road. I heard myself talking too much, the way a frightened man talks too much, filling the terrible silence with the reassuring machinery of my ordinary life, permits and parcels and easements, as if by reciting the vocabulary of the normal world, I could make the normal world reassert itself around me. He let me talk. He listened with his head slightly tilted, and when I ran down, he asked me whose church I had taken this to be, and I said I did not know, that it was on no map, and something moved across his lined face that might have been amusement and might have been grief. I asked him whose church this was and whose graves, and the old man's face changed when I mentioned the graves. Something moved behind those colourless eyes, quick and hard. He asked me if I had walked among the stones. I said I had. He asked me, very carefully, spacing the words, if I had touched anything. I said I had not, which was true. He seemed relieved by that, and it was his relief, more than anything, that frightened me. Because a man is not relieved that you did not touch the graves of his family. Relief like that is not about propriety. A man is relieved like that only when he has been afraid you would do something he could not undo. He was relieved the way you are relieved when a child has been playing near a loaded gun and you find out, after, that they never touched it. That was the quality of his relief. And I stood there in the doorway of that clean white church in the swallowed silence of that bottom, and I understood that there was something in that graveyard that must not be touched, and that he had been genuinely afraid I had touched it, and that my not having touched it was, to him, a piece of enormous and unexpected good fortune. He told me to come inside. I did not go inside. Every instinct I had, the ones that had kept me alive in that country for years, the ones that tell you when a slope is going to slide, or when a bear is between you and her cubs, all of them told me not to cross that threshold. There is a kind of knowing that lives below thought. In the oldest part of the animal we still are, and every cell of that old animal was telling me that if I stepped through that door, I would not step back out of it, or that if I did step back out, I would not be the same thing that had stepped in. I told him I could not stay, that I was expected back, and that I had told others exactly where I was, which was true, and which I said deliberately so, that he would understand I was not a man who could simply disappear, without questions being asked. I watched him take that in. I saw him understand me. There was a shrewdness in him, an old intelligence, and I saw him weigh what I had said, and set aside whatever he had been considering, and he did not argue. Instead, he did something that has haunted me more than anything he said. He reached inside the door, to a small table just within, and he took from it a book, and he held it out to me across the threshold. It was a hymnal, a small, thick, black book, its cover worn soft, its spine cracked. He told me to take it. He told me that if I meant to come back, and he said this as though he already knew I would, as though my coming back were a settled fact of the future that he could see and I could not, then I should learn the songs first, because a man who came without knowing the songs would not be able to leave a second time. And he said, and I have never forgotten the exact words, that the ground here was patient, but it was not kind, and that they sang so that it would keep sleeping, and that they had been singing for 100 years and would sing for 100 more, God willing, and that if the singing ever stopped, the whole mountain would remember what was under it. I took the book. I do not know why. My hand simply took it, the way your hand takes a thing that is held out to you, before your mind can decide anything, a reflex of ordinary human courtesy, operating in a situation that had left ordinary human courtesy far behind. The book was cold, colder than the cold air. It was cold the way a stone is cold when you dig it out of the shaded ground, a cold that had come up out of somewhere the sun does not reach. And the moment it was in my hand, the old man stepped back and the doors closed, not slammed but drawn shut smoothly from within, and the singing began again, exactly where it had left off, on the same note, the same word, as though no time had passed at all, as though the interruption of my knocking, and the opening of the doors, and the whole conversation, had been a stone dropped into a stream that closed over it without a ripple, and flowed on, exactly as before. I walked out of that clearing faster than I have ever walked, and when the road began to climb, I ran, and I did not stop running until my lungs gave out, and I had to bend over a boulder and be sick. The hymnal was in my jacket. I could feel it against my chest the whole way up, that stone-cold weight over my heart, and I remember thinking, in the animal panic of that climb, that I should throw it away, that I should fling it off into the laurel, and never touch it again. And I remember that I did not, that my hand would not do it, that some part of me had already begun to keep that book, the way you keep a thing you have promised to keep. The birds came back as I climbed. That is a detail I hold on to. About 2/3 of the way up the road, the world switched back on around me. The wind first, then the small rustling life of the leaf litter, then a single crow somewhere far off, and then the whole ordinary machinery of the October woods. And I have never in my life been so glad to hear a crow. I climbed up out of that silence into sound the way a drowning man climbs up into air, and when I reached the ridge and the boundary line and the ordinary steep familiar ground, I sat down in the leaves with my back against a hickory tree, and I shook for a long time, and I did not care that I was a grown man and a federal officer sitting alone in the woods shaking like a child. I made it back to my camp on the ridge as the last light was going. I raised dispatch on the radio that night, ahead of my scheduled check-in, and this is the first piece of hard evidence I can offer you, because the Forest Service kept radio logs, and those logs exist, and I have seen a copy of the relevant page. My call is recorded. The log notes that I reported an unmapped structure and cemetery in the Sable Run drainage, and requested that the record be checked against the districts in holding files. The dispatcher who took the call, a woman named Brenda who I knew well, and who is, I am sorry to say, no longer living, noted the coordinates I gave. Those coordinates are in the log. I did not tell Brenda about the singing, or the old man, or the book. I told her the professional version, the version that could go in a log, an unmapped structure and a cemetery, and I asked her to check the in-holding files, and she said she would, and she asked me if I was all right, because she said my voice sounded funny, and I said I was fine. I was just tired. It had been a long day, and she said get some rest, and that was the last ordinary conversation I had before the whole shape of the world began to change. I did not sleep that night. I sat up in my tent with the lantern on, and I took the hymnal out, and I held it in my lap, and I did not open it, and I listened to the woods, which were ordinary and busy and alive around me on that high ridge, and I told myself the ordinary explanations one after another, all night long, the way you tell yourself a fever will break. A private church, a wary congregation I hadn't seen arrive, an old man performing some family ritual, the singing a trick of the acoustics in that closed bottom, some echo, some fold of the land that carried sound from a hollow I couldn't see. I built explanation after explanation, and each one stood for a while and then fell down, because none of them could account for the photograph I had not yet developed, or the closed doors of a building I had watched, or a silence with weight, or a book as cold as a grave, or the relief of a man who was glad I had not touched the earth over his dead. When I came off the mountain 2 days later, having finished my survey work in a fog of distraction, I went straight to the district office, and I pulled every map and record we had, and I laid them out, and I did the work that was my whole profession, which was to reconcile the ground I had walked with the record of that ground. And I could not find the church. I could not find the road. I could not find the cemetery. I found the 2 streams that formed the confluence. I found the ridge and the drainage. I found the old iron survey pins. Everything else on that mountain matched the record to the foot. But at the place where I had stood in a mowed churchyard and taken a hymnal from an old man's hand, the record showed nothing but forest. The 1930s survey showed forest. The timber company's meticulous reconnaissance showed forest. And when I overlaid the coordinates I had given Brenda, the coordinates in the radio log, they fell on a slope of unbroken timber, a quarter mile from any watercourse, on ground I knew, on ground I had actually walked on the second day, ground that was steep and rocky and could not possibly have held a graded road, a clearing, a church, and 40 graves. I told myself I had made an error in the field. Surveyors are trained to distrust themselves, and I distrusted myself thoroughly, and I want you to know that I did the honest work of a man trying to prove himself wrong. I rechecked my compass. I rewalked the boundary line on paper, station by station, bearing by bearing, and it was clean, it closed. My traverse closed to within a foot over 3 miles, which is the work of a competent man and not the work of a man who got lost. There was no error. My survey was correct. And my correct survey put me on a boundary line that ran along the eastern slope of that ridge and never went down into the bottom at all, because the boundary line did not go down into the bottom. And I knew that. I had known it the whole time, and yet I had followed a road down into that bottom that the boundary line did not touch. A road that was not on the map I was surveying. A road that led to a place that the very ground I had proven, with my own closed and correct traverse, said could not be there. Both things were true. My survey was correct and the church was real. I had stood in it. I had the book, and there is no map in the world on which both of those things can be true at once, and that is the first crack through which the impossible got into my life and never left. I decided that I had to know what had been up there, whatever the maps said, and so I began the research, because I could not leave it alone, and because a part of me still believed, still desperately wanted to believe, that there was a document somewhere that would make it all lie down flat and reasonable again. I went to the county courthouse and I searched the deed books. I searched by every family name I had read on those gravestones, all those scattered surnames from all those scattered hollows, and I found something that at first seemed to solve everything, and then, the longer I looked at it, unsolved everything much worse. There had been a community up there. It was real. In the deed books and in a bound volume of the county's history that some local society had published in the 1930s, I found references to a settlement in that drainage. It had a name. I am not going to write the name, and you will understand why by the end. It was a small, closed, intensely religious community that had settled in that hollow before the Civil War, an offshoot of some hard-shell Baptist tradition that had gone its own way and become something the surrounding countryside regarded with a mixture of fear and respect. The county history described them in the guarded, uncomfortable way that local histories describe the neighbors nobody talks about. It said they kept to themselves. It said they did not welcome visitors. It said they buried their dead in their own ground and did not register the deaths with the county, which is why, I realized, so many of those surnames had seemed to vanish from the record. They had not moved away or died out. They had simply stopped appearing in the county's paperwork because the community had withdrawn from the county entirely, and from the state, and from the century, and had become a thing that only its neighbors half remembered and did not speak of. The history said something else, in the careful language of a local historian who does not want to seem to endorse a superstition, but who cannot leave it out either. It said the community had come to that particular hollow deliberately, that they had not simply settled where the land was good, but had chosen that bottom, that specific ground, for reasons their founder had described in religious terms that the history quoted second-hand and clearly did not understand. The founder, a preacher whose name I will also keep to myself, had led his people to that drainage because, he said, there was something sleeping under it, and it had fallen to them, chosen them, to keep it sleeping. The history put this in the tone of a man describing a quaint delusion. But I had stood in that bottom, and I had heard the old man say the ground was patient but not kind, and I did not read it as a quaint delusion. I read it as a job description. And then, in 1890, according to the county history, the community had died. That was the word the history used. Not disbanded, not moved, died. In the winter of 1889 into 1890, there had been what the history called a sickness, and in the spring, when a party of men from the nearest town finally went up to check on them, having not seen a single soul from the community come down to trade in months, they found the settlement empty. The houses were standing, the livestock was dead in the barns, dead in their stalls where they had starved with no one to feed them, which told the men that whatever had happened all at once, that there had been no one left even to open a barn door, and the graveyard, the history said, was full of fresh graves, more graves than there had been people, which is a sentence I have read perhaps 1,000 times, and which does not become less impossible with repetition. More graves than there had been people. The men who found it did not stay to count. They came down off that mountain and they did not go back, and within a few years the road that led up there had been deliberately, the history said, allowed to grow over, and by some accounts had been actively destroyed, the culverts thrown down and the grade dug through, by men who wanted to be sure no one wandered up there by accident. And the place passed into the kind of story that grandmothers tell to keep children close to home, and the Coulters and the other old families kept clear of that bottom for 100 years, and told their children to keep clear of it, and Emmett Coulter told me to keep clear of it, and I did not listen. The county history was published in 1936. It stated plainly that the settlement had been abandoned and its buildings left to rot for nearly 50 years, and that nothing remained of it by then but ruins swallowed by the forest. The historian had gone up there himself, in the 1930s, to see. He described what he found: cellar holes, a fallen chimney, the sunken graves of the old churchyard, all of it deep in the returned forest, all of it exactly what 50 years of Appalachian weather does to abandoned works of men. He described, specifically, the church, a collapsed ruin, he wrote, its roof fallen in, its walls caving, a young hickory growing up through the floor where the pulpit had been, a collapsed ruin, in 1936, with a tree growing through its floor. I had photographed that church 58 years later, with fresh white paint and sound windows, and a clean swept step, and I had taken a book from the hand of a man standing in its doorway, and I had heard 8 voices, or more than 8, singing in it in the old style, and the county's own history, written by a careful man who had walked the ground, said that the building had been a roofless ruin, with a tree growing through it, 2 decades before I was even born. I had that book open on the table in front of me, the county history, and in my other hand I had the hymnal. I had been afraid to open the hymnal. I want you to understand that. For weeks it had sat in a drawer in my house, and I had not looked inside it, because I am not an especially superstitious man, but I am a careful one, and the old man's warning about learning the songs had lodged in me like a splinter. Learn the songs first, he had said, because a man who came without knowing the songs would not be able to leave a second time. I did not intend ever to go back, and so by his own logic I had no reason to learn the songs, and every reason not to, and I had reasoned my way into leaving the book shut, and I had left it shut for weeks, and it had sat in that drawer like a coal that would not cool. But that night, with the county history telling me that everyone who could have sung to me had been dead for over 100 years, that the building I had stood in front of had been a ruin before my birth, I could no longer bear not knowing what was in the book. I opened it. It was a hymnal in the shape note tradition, printed, an old edition, the pages foxed and soft, the corners rounded with handling. The printed date in the front was 1858, which fit, which was the kind of book that community would have carried into that hollow before the war. Most of it was ordinary, hymns I half recognized in their older forms, The fierce old Calvinist hymns about wrath and the grave and the shortness of life, printed in the four-shape notation those congregations used, the fa, sol, la, mi shapes that let unschooled people read music by sight. It was, for its first 100 and some pages, exactly what it appeared to be, an artifact of a real and vanished American religious world, the kind of thing a museum would be glad to have. But bound into the back, sewn in by hand with waxed thread, were pages that were not printed but written, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, in ink gone brown with age. They were hymns too, laid out like hymns, with the words broken into verses. But they were not like any hymns I have ever seen. The words were in English, but they did not scan like worship. They were addresses. They spoke to something, directly, the way you speak to a person in the room with you, and what they said, over and over, in different words, was a plea. They asked something to be still. They asked it to sleep. They promised it songs, and they promised it the dead, and they promised it patience, and they asked it, in return, to keep sleeping, to keep its face turned down into the dark, to not, and this phrase appeared 3 times in 3 different hymns, to not come up into the light and see how few of them were left. I read them all. I made myself read them all, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with my wife asleep upstairs, and they got worse as they went. The early ones, in the oldest and steadiest hand, were almost gentle, almost tender, the way you might sing to a sleeping child you loved and also feared, coaxing, reassuring. But the later ones, in hands that grew shakier and more crowded and more desperate down the years, were not tender. They were the songs of people who were losing, who knew they were losing, who were singing into a dark that was pressing back against them a little harder every year, and they bargained. That is the word for it. The later hymns bargained. They offered the thing under the ground the only currency they had, which was themselves, which was their own dead, laid into the ground above it, one after another, to weigh it down and keep it sleeping. The fresh mounds. I understood the fresh mounds then, and I wished I did not. At the bottom of the last handwritten page, there was a line that was not part of the hymn. It was a note, in the same brown ink, in the same hand as the last and most desperate of the hymns. It read, "We are too few now to sing every night. We take turns. When the last of us is gone, God have mercy on whoever hears the silence." And beneath that, in different ink, darker, newer, in a different and shakier hand, someone had written a date. The date was in the 1970s. I sat with that for a very long time, because a book that had been sung from by a community that died in 1890 should not have an entry in it from the 1970s. Someone had still been singing, 80 years after the county said they had all died, more than 80 years after a careful historian had found their church a roofless ruin, with a tree growing through it. Someone had still been up there, turning the pages of this book, keeping the count of who was left, taking their turn. And that someone, or the last of that someone's kin, had been standing in the doorway of a freshly painted church in October of 1994, handing the book to me. I need to tell you about the part of this I have told almost no one, because it is the part that convinced me, finally and completely, past any hope of doubt. After I found the county history, I became, for a while, obsessed. I could not work. My marriage, already dying, went into its last decline in those months, and I do not blame her. I was not a husband anyone could have lived with. I was a man who came home from the office with photocopies and old books, and sat up all night filling notebooks. I tracked down everything I could find. And I found, in the archives of a small historical society 2 counties over, a folder of material that a graduate student had gathered in the 1970s, a young man who had been doing a thesis on vanished religious communities of the region, and who had, apparently, done exactly what I was doing, followed the paper trail up into that bottom. His notes were in the folder. His photographs were in the folder. And in the folder there was a final page, a note from the Historical Society that said the student had failed to return from a research trip into the field in the autumn of 1974, that a search had been conducted, that no trace of him had ever been found, and that his materials had been donated to the society by his family. The autumn of 1974. The date written in the hymnal. in the shaky newer hand, beneath the note about taking turns, was in the autumn of 1974. His photographs were of the church, and they showed it exactly as I had seen it. Fresh white paint, sound roof, clean windows, not a ruin, not a tree growing through the floor. A cared-for, occupied, impossible church, photographed in 1974 by a young man who then walked into it, or was handed a book by it, and was never seen again, and whose hand, I am as certain as I am of anything, wrote that date in the back of the hymnal that a man who was already 100 years dead later placed in my palm. He had not learned the songs in time. That is what I believe. He came without knowing them, and the old man's warning is the truest thing in this whole account. A man who came without knowing the songs would not be able to leave a second time. The student went up there once and photographed it and came back, and then he went up a second time, and he did not know the songs, and he did not come back, and someone wrote his last date in the book, and the count went down by one more, and the singing got a little thinner, and the dark under the ground pressed up a little harder. I did the only thing left that could either damn or save my sanity, which was to go back to the beginning of my own evidence, to the one thing that could not lie, and I took my roll of film to be developed. I had put it off for months. I had shot most of a roll that week, the survey documentation, the culverts, the church, and the roll had sat in my desk drawer beside the hymnal all that time because I was afraid of it. I finally took it in. I got the prints back in one of those paper envelopes from the drugstore, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot, and I went through them one at a time. The culverts were there, the dry-laid stone, exactly as I remembered. The roadbed was there, the graves were there, the old carved stones and the fresh, unmarked mounds, exactly as I remembered. And seeing them in a photograph, ordinary and flat and real in the drugstore print, was its own kind of horror, because it meant they were real. It meant I had not imagined the fresh graves. And then I came to the photograph of the church, the straight-on shot I had framed on the closed doors, the one I had taken not 20 minutes before the old man opened them, before I had heard a single voice, when I believed with certainty that the building was empty and locked, when I had lowered the camera and stood in a silent, empty clearing. In the photograph, the doors of the church are standing open, and in the doorway, and at every one of the tall, narrow windows down the side of the church, there are faces, pale, indistinct, turned toward the camera. I counted them once, and I have never counted them again. There are far more than 8. There are more faces in those windows than that little church could have held, people standing shoulder to shoulder, ranks of them behind ranks of them, a pale crowd pressed against every opening, and they are all looking at me, at the man behind the camera, at the exact spot where I stood in an empty churchyard on a bright October afternoon and pressed a shutter and heard, in that moment, nothing at all. Nothing. There had been no one. I had photographed an empty building, and the film, which does not lie, which cannot tell itself comforting stories the way a frightened mind can, recorded a church packed to its walls with the pale watching dead, in the same instant that my living eyes saw an empty and shut-up house. That is the photograph. I have it still. I have looked at it perhaps 4 times in 30 years, and each time I put it away I promise myself I will never look at it again. And so far, I have kept that promise longer each time. I never filed a full report. What would I have written? I told my supervisor I had been unable to confirm the inholding, and that the boundary line did not, in the end, affect the timber company's road, which was true, and the matter was closed the way most matters are closed, quietly, from lack of anyone who cares to pursue them. The timber company got its road, running along the eastern slope, a good quarter-mile from that bottom, and as far as I know it is up there still, hauling out timber, and no one who drives it has any idea what lies down in the drainage below, sleeping, or waiting, or listening for the singing to stop. I requested different assignments after that. I stayed away from that district. I got my divorce, and some years later I remarried, and my second wife is a good woman, who knows only that I saw something bad in the woods once, and does not press me about it. I retired earlier than I had planned. I never went back up that road, and I could not have found it if I had tried, because I did try, once, from the ridge, in daylight, with all my maps and all my experience. 3 years after the first time, on a bright day, with a purpose to prove to myself that I was a rational man. I walked the eastern boundary line to the exact place where the road had met it. There was no road. There was steep, rocky ground falling away into the drainage, timber, laurel, the ordinary tangled slope of an Appalachian hillside, and nowhere at all, was there a graded road with dry-laid culverts leading down to a clearing. I stood at the place where I had turned downhill 3 years before, and I looked down into that bottom, and it was just forest, exactly as the record has always said, and I felt the swallowed silence begin to gather in the low ground below me, the birds going quiet down there, the way they had gone quiet before, and I turned around, and I walked back up to the ridge, and I have never set foot on that mountain again. But here is the thing I have carried, the thing that finally made me write all this down, the reason I could not simply die with it folded up small inside me. The old man told me they took turns. He told me they were too few. He told me that when the last of them was gone, God have mercy on whoever heard the silence. That handwritten date from 1974, that vanished graduate student, means that as of 20 years before I stood in that clearing, someone was still keeping the count, and the count was already going down. And I have thought, every single night for 30 years, about what it means that when I called into that church, before the old man opened the door, there was no answer. And then there was singing, 6 or 8 voices, no more. And then there was silence again, complete, the most complete silence I have ever stood inside. And then the door opened, and there was one old man, and behind him a darkness that I felt full of watchers but could not see. Watchers that the camera saw, and I did not. And he was so very relieved, so desperately relieved, that a stranger had come walking down the road that no living map remembers, and that the stranger could be given the book, could be taught the songs, could be made into one more voice for a choir that was down to almost nothing, and losing more ground every winter. They are not evil. I have come to believe that, and it is the part of this that lets me sleep at all on the nights I sleep. They were not monsters, and they are not monsters now, whatever they have become. They were people who found something under a mountain that should not be woken, and who gave up their lives, and then their deaths, and then whatever comes after their deaths, to keep it sleeping, to sing it down, generation after generation, taking turns in the dark, because they believed, and I have come to believe they were right, that if they stopped, something would come up into the light that the world is much better off not seeing. They are not the horror, they are the ones holding the horror shut, and they are down to almost nothing. I never learned the songs. I want that on the record. Whatever the old man wanted, whatever he was preparing me to become, I never learned them, and I have kept that book closed in a locked box for 30 years, so that I would never accidentally learn them, because I am a coward, and because I would like to die in my own bed, and not standing in the dark in a church that isn't on any map, singing to keep a mountain asleep. I am mailing the hymnal to a university archive along with these pages. Let someone else decide what it is. Let scholars date the ink and the paper, and argue about the handwriting, and file it under folklore, and forget it, which is what I hope they do, because the alternative is that someone believes me, and goes looking, and finds the road, because the road, the old man said, does not open for everyone, and I have wondered every day since what it was about me that made it open, and whether that same something is in you, reading this. But I opened the box last week, for the first time in years, to prepare the book for shipping, and I made myself look through it one more time, all the way to the back, to the handwritten hymns, and the note about taking turns, and the date from 1974, in the vanished student's shaking hand. There is a new line of handwriting on the last page. It is in fresh ink, not brown with age, but black and new. It was not there when I locked the box 30 years ago. No one else has the key. My wife has never seen the book. The box has sat in the back of my closet, locked, untouched, in a house with an alarm, for 3 decades. It says only, you still have time to learn them. We are down to 1. That concludes tonight's file. If you've ever experienced something strange or unexplained, I'd love to hear your story. You can share it in the comments, or send it to the email in the description. It might become a future case on Midnight Files. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join me for more documentary-style horror stories. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones we never forget.